Welcome to TAMA Talks, brought to you by the Torrance Art Museum Advocates. I'm Janine Madden, current TAMA president, and I'd like to thank you for watching. Today, we will be discussing work which is scheduled to show at the Art Museum in the spring of 2025 in Gallery 2. The Torrance Art Museum is located at 3320 Civic Center Drive in Torrance, California, and is open Tuesday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Admission is free and donations are gratefully accepted. This discussion is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel with all of our previous TAMA Talks. You can access it from our website, www.tamadvocates.com. Joining us today is artist Zavier Ellis, whose solo show will open in March of 2025 in Gallery 2 at the museum. Zavier was born in Windsor in the United Kingdom. He read History of Modern Art at Manchester University before undertaking a master's in fine art at City and Guilds of London Art School. He has exhibited globally and his work is featured in notable private collections. Zavier combines the use of text with painterly, collage, assemblage, and photographic techniques. Street signs, historical graffiti, worn posters, and weathered surfaces are referenced by etching, collaging, painting, and other means. Combined with intense and layered application of traditional and industrial paints, drawings, collage, recycled studio detritus, and preparatory or found materials, Ellis creates a dynamic that oscillates between the cerebral and the physical, conscious and unconscious, organized and chaotic, premeditated and instinctive. With a unique perspective on contemporary history painting, Ellis's practice involves deep research into specific subjects, focusing especially on revolution, resistance and conflict, informing his choice of collage elements, color codes, measurements, and text. Ellis creates an internal and personalized symbolism derived from this research. The use of text is fundamental to his approach. While adopting rhetorical and propaganda techniques, especially focusing on repetition, he selects words according to their historical or political usage. Always fragmented, Ellis embraces the broken, derelict, incomplete, and mistaken to invite new meanings and interpretations. Fundamentally explores the complexity of history and the tendency for events, methods, and motivations to repeat themselves with different iterations. He draws on the past to inform the present and warn against the future. Zavier is also the director of the Contemporary Art Academy. Co-founded along with Matthew Gibson in 2022, the Contemporary Art Academy ethos is drawn from their high-level experience of running galleries, curating museum-scale exhibitions, advising world-class collectors, making and exhibiting, teaching, and running residency and educational programs. With the mission of making premium art education accessible to all, Contemporary Art Academy's innovative, content-packed courses are offered at genuinely affordable prices and are democratizing art education. Bound by generosity, Contemporary Art Academy creates supportive online cohorts that enable artists to become part of a thriving and ever-expanding international community. Contemporary Art Academy is helping artists to grow their networks, experience breakthrough moments, and gain confidence. So welcome, Zavier. We're really excited to hear about both Art Academy and your solo show that will be opening in Gallery 2 at the Torrance Art Museum in March of 2025.
Thank you, Janine. Really great to be here, and I appreciate your time. Thank you for a wonderful introduction as well. Yeah, I'm thoroughly looking forward to the exhibition in March 25. I'm treating it as something like a mini retrospective. So we'll be exhibiting work that I've made over the last 5 years, let's say. And also will be debuting exclusive new work, which will be unseen. And so, yeah, you've invited me to share some images. What I'm about to do is actually something that I'm training myself not to do, which is to completely unpack the work. So maybe we'll do that, maybe we won't, but I think that's the agenda. And the reason I say that is because um, I really consider the work as history painting. You know, it's a kind of contemporary form of history painting. And by that, I mean that I make work that revolves on around particular passages in time and particular subjects, and I do a lot of heavy research, and that involves, you know, reading history books, reading fiction around from around the time or focusing on the subjects, podcasts, YouTube, feature films, you know, whatever I can alight on. So I'm constantly feeding myself with information, and perhaps that there's an autodidactic sense to this. And what I learn in my research then comes to inform the work and the decisions that I make that go into the work, whether it's the colors or the text or the collage, sometimes even the dimension of the paintings as well. Um, and so, of course, it's, you know, I'm prone to unpacking it when somebody asks me what's happening in a particular painting or a particular series. Um, but I'm trying to teach myself to actually hear from the audience first, and to know what their interpretations are, because I think it's very important um, to hear other people's thoughts and alternative readings to the work. And I completely embrace that. So even though there's a lot of research and direction that goes into making the paintings, I do actually want them to be completely open to interpretation.
Really?
Uh,
That's
yeah,
very
absolutely.
interesting. I like it, of course, because it's sort of it then involves the viewer because no one really wants to look at it and get it wrong. You know, based on your research, there's obviously intent behind it. But if we're just looking at it and maybe not quite fully quote unquote understanding, um, I like the idea that you do leave some of it open to interpretation.
Absolutely. No, well, I think the first thing to say that there is no wrong. Any interpretation is a valid interpretation as far as I'm concerned, with certainly my practice, and maybe I'd expand that to any artist practice. I think it's a three-way relationship between the artist, the object, and the audience, and the work isn't quite complete until it reaches the audience. But also, I'm quite into mistakes, actually. I think mistakes are important. And as you mentioned in the introduction, you know, one of my, uh, visually speaking, but beyond that as well, um, something that goes into the work that sort of inspires the work is graffiti, but not really stylized. You know, I'm not talking kind of stylized subway art graffiti, even though that was a big interest when I was younger. But kind of hand hand drawn, rough, instinctive graffiti, almost like an outpouring. And you remind me of work that I've made historically where I've appropriated um, misspelt graffiti or grammatically incorrect graffiti. I remember seeing um, just really rough spray paint that spelt out alcohol in like underneath a bridge, and I found it so fascinating that someone had written alcohol to begin with,
Yeah.
and but also then misspelt it. But
Yeah.
then I started going through these loops as time went on, and that went into a painting at the time. And then I started wondering if my version of spelling it was incorrect or mistaken, and whether they were right. And then I just, you know, so I kind of embraced this. And the other one I remember, which also went into a painting, and this graffiti was written really big and again really rough on the top of a bridge in London near the South Bank, so going over the Thames. And it said, "May God have mercy on your soul."
Ah,
And
okay.
again, there was a poignancy to it because there's a sort of there's an outpouring and there's a request. Perhaps it was, we could read it as "May God have mercy on my soul," but the two halves in there were just, so there's this kind of sense of cognitive dissonance, which I find really interesting. So therefore, I completely embrace that, and there are no mistaken interpretations.
Okay.
So within this painting, this will be one of the earliest paintings in the exhibition, and that's 2019. And this was during a period that marked the beginning of this series, and I might say the beginning of my mature phase actually, when any artists that are listening to this will appreciate the fact, I think, that it's a constant journey to really understand your internal critical model. Why do you make the work you make? Why do you use the materials you use? Why do you want to talk about this particular subject or embrace it or explore it? And I think that during this period is when I really got to the nub of my own internal critical model. But that's not to say that it's a finished game, or that this is any end game, because I think also that internal critical model can shift and move and shape shift. But this is when I got really targeted about the subject matter, um, and it started with just wanting to know a bit more about Napoleon, and how that came, I don't know, but something triggered me to sort of become interested in Napoleon. Of course, there's been the great big feature film recently and so on, but at this time, I just wanted to know. So I read a biography about Napoleon and found it fascinating. And then that took me back into the French Revolution because I wanted to know about the French Revolution. And in actual fact, I remember touching on it in my history of art degree. And at that point, I wasn't particularly interested in what was happening in the 18th and 19th centuries. I was much more focused on modernism, that kind of modernism with a capital M. Um, but latterly, I started reading about it and just found it so incredibly fascinating. And so I researched really, really heavily, and I just kind of fell down this French Revolution rabbit hole, and stayed in there for a while and made a lot of work about it. And so, for example, to do the unpacking that I'm trying to teach myself not to, um, I think perhaps the audience might take this, it's an abstract painting. There's material abstraction. There's freedom within the sort of technical application in combination with sort of very tight, more geometric abstraction. We might say there's collage, there's text, um, and that's what I'm interested to know. How does that communicate with the audience? But for example, the green underpainting. I started painting all of these works within the series with a green underpainting because that was the first symbolic color during the time of the French Revolution. So this is before there was a tricolor. It's before the tricolor was designed, which did come during the revolution. But green was the first symbolic color. And the early revolutionaries it came from picking a sprig from a tree and sort of putting it in behind the ear. And then they started wearing green cockades. And so there's this sort of underlying symbolism that I mentioned earlier, as did you, that goes into the decision making of the work. Um, the text also will relate to the research. And also then beyond the green, the color codes of the red, white, and blue. I mean, interestingly, the French Revolution followed the American Revolution, so I always feel that there's a bit of the American Revolution within this series as well, because certainly the French were very inspired by
Right.
that. In actual fact, 13 became a very symbolic number for the French revolutionaries, and a good luck number. And that's because at the time, there were 13 American states. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you have 13 stripes in the flag, which also reference that. So that's the kind of symbolism that I just find really interesting and engaging. And so when I'm making these works, I'm kind of looping back and embracing what happened back then. And also there is I really believe that within the work, or within perhaps the work is a sort of route into this, like a prism. Um, I think that we can seek understanding in the past. I think it can help us understand what's happening now. I mean, you've just had a very important election. We had the civil rights movement from the 60s, maybe the 50s onwards. And a lot of that is rooted much deeper into the past. And we also have um, we have the war in Gaza currently as well. And, you know, this is not a recent thing, of course. It's something that has repeated and returned throughout history, and specifically, without to go into it in too much detail, but it's another subject which perhaps we'll get onto, you know, from imperialism through the centuries and certainly after the First World War. So I think we can look back at history to understand the present and why things are as they are. And this is what I'm attempting to do in the work. And I'm also interested in a kind of Deleuzean sense. I'm interested in repetition and the recycling of events, or perhaps even protagonists throughout history, but with different iterations. You know, that we have seen a lot of this before, but in
Yes. Yeah.
different form. And I think that there's a learning in there.
And I think there's a degree of resiliency that, results from that. Like, this isn't the first time this has happened. And, granted, there are always casualties, but at the end of the day, as a species, we do persevere. So,
Well, yeah, we do indeed. Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, in a sense, and this is also within the work, it's a little bit about deconditioning, or addressing what we are conditioned into thinking through, you know, our upbringing or by society. And we also have to embrace the fact that there are others that don't think the way we do.
correct.
And, you know, and therefore that's why we have democracy, right? And we have to accept it. Not that everybody has recently, but
Mhm.
so anyway, this is an early piece within that series of the French Revolution. And it went on to, perhaps I should say as well, the collage elements. You know, I discovered that there's an amazing resource library at Stanford, and there's an open library where you can source imagery. So within the collage elements, um, they are all um, they're all images derived from original French Revolution era engravings, or
Yeah.
books or newspapers. And so
Okay. Yeah.
it's,
I think in the upper, I don't know. I don't think you can see my cursor in the upper. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I see like, yes. In the right side, it almost looks like a bust. Could just be my
yeah,
anthropomorphic tendency to make something, but it almost looks like if I look from a distance in that upper right hand corner,
mm,
that looks very like a bust of something. It actually looks very George Washingtonish to me, but I'm sure that is not what's there. Maybe it's someone else.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's
But
not, but it could be again. You know, so this is up to you.
so you were
Um,
saying that you found these are it found images that you then incorporated into this work.
exactly. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly. And then so they'll have, you know, but they are direct references to events that happened uh, during the time. And also this leads us into another element of the work, which is, again, we could relate it to repetition, but propaganda, you know, and how repetition informs propaganda. And so there are sort of propaganda images within this as well. I mean, the image that you're talking about, that you're referring to, is that's a sculpture of um, uh, 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 the god of reason, which is, you know,
okay. Oh,
and I'll I'll refer to literature or to fine art, historical art, culture generally within the work as well. Because that's, it's important what happened around the periods as well. And this is how we get to particular thought patterns, isn't it? And, we touched on it with democracy. There's one side, there's a minority, and there's another side that's a majority, and they tend to flip around. But each has their mode of thought and their way of thinking, and they're informed by their particular sources. So in a way, really, we could say that it might be less about the policies and more about the marketing.
Sure, sure. Okay.
And there's another element to these. Perhaps we'll move on to a different image, but this is also a piece that's a part of the French Revolution series, really when it reached its pinnacle. And the fact of the matter is that city walls have always been places where political messaging and sloganeering has taken place. So they're a site, or they were very much, but they still are, aren't they? They're a site of communication. And so that is also always at the back of my mind. There's a kind of underlying reference to that. You'll see in this piece, this is huge. In UK money, this is 270 centimeters by 2 meters. So I'd estimate about 7 feet across and maybe 9, 10 feet tall. So quite a monumental piece.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see the harlequins from this piece folded into this one. And I actually had the interpretation of halving the painting again with harlequins. And I started out with them, but then during the process, I'll have an idea where I'm going with the work beforehand. But then, of course, it's a dialogue with the work. The work talks to me and leads me as well, or throws up new ideas. And so I just wanted to become a little bit more subtle, perhaps. I think there's a better word, but just about that use of the harlequin. So it didn't go halfway. And the title was always going to be Revolt Repeat. So I think also within my work, a way in is always through the titles as well. So Revolt Repeat, obviously thinking about repetition, thinking about revolution. And I was planning to put in this text across the bottom. So everything you see there is sort of handwritten text, as in sign written text.
Yeah.
And then I started to visualize it upside down when I was looking at it. And I flipped it. I kind of worked up some designs. I was also going to write repeat along the bottom in its totality. But as you mentioned in the introduction, I very much fragment text, and I think fragmentation is within the work, absolutely, and is an area that I want to research further, actually, because it's becoming so a real cornerstone to the practice.
And at the end of the day, that fragmentation is, directly a direct correlation to revolt when you think
Yeah,
about it.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so I started visualizing the upside down text, and so I want it to operate as if you can imagine the piece turning. The old idea of revolt. The word comes from revolving. Revolution, the revolution of an object.
Mhm.
Um, so that's what kind of fed into these compositional decisions. And then the other thing that happened within this painting, I mean, again, as I've already referenced, you have the green underpainting, very subtle reference to the tricolor running across these strips in the middle. So these are kind of painted strips. Previously, I've used tape. It's really important to me to use mixed materials, whatever I might have at hand, but also low as well as high materials, everyday materials. But what started happening within this painting, I wanted to bring in more modern visual references. So even though the collage here is really fragmented, But these are images from the May '68 riots in Paris, and I started to think, much more about that trajectory, from deep history through modern the modern period into the contemporary, and so that's where the thinking evolved somewhat during making this piece. And also the collage started becoming really fragmented. I mean, the earlier one, you can see they're kind of rectangular pages that are collaged, and then there's an element of destruction and decollage. But here they really start, really being downgraded, um, and also become more painterly. So the collage becomes a much more painterly device. And I do see it that way now. It is like having another painterly material to hand. And the other thing that started really coming through here is, you see this sort of white mass in the middle. They start to suggest land masses. So you have that idea of place and geography, which of course, this is very much the reason, and again the site where events happen. And I started thinking much more about, this interest in revolution, and then going into the '68 Paris riots, thinking much more about resistance and protests, and then going towards the idea of conflict. And the working title for the exhibition is Sites of Conflict, which comes from the titles within the paintings. This is a more recent painting, so this is into 2023 now, which is part of a series of smaller work. So this is 30 by 24 centimeters, so more like 12 inches tall. And I also opened up the subject matter. So in this painting, yes, I'm still working with the French Revolution, but also, as I suggested, Paris '68 riots. Then I started opening up the subject. There was a series of 6 paintings that I made, this being the Exodus series, which I'll tell you more about, and this being the Freiheit series, which again I'll tell you more about. So you can see that there were 2 paintings from each series, a series of 3, tend to work in threes, which interestingly is also a kind of rhetorical device as well. And you'll see that with a lot of political sloganeering, there'll be 3 words, like take back control. So, this very much the idea around this painting is what I've already discussed with the French Revolution. But if we just think about the harlequins here, the black harlequin pattern, when I was looking at this painting, I started to visualize them as grids. This became really heavily collaged, this work, but you can just see in the top section that it's underpainted as a grid. And this originally is something that I had in mind for quite some time, and the original reference, it was military flags and continues to be military flags. But I find that the audience will often suggest chess playing. It looks like a checkerboard, like a chessboard, which again is, another interpretation and something I hadn't thought about actually, which although visually it's an obvious thing to consider. And of course, that has real relevance as well, power, strategy, conflict, let's say. So, and during this series, the war in Ukraine started. So I was making this work about the revolution and the '68 riots, and then alongside it, work about effectively the birth of monotheism. So what I wanted to do here was look back to where does Christianity come from, and therefore where does Islam come from, and of course both come from Judaism. And I went back to the very, very beginning. The reason being, I touched on it earlier, I'd like to address the conditioning. So, I grew up in a Church of England school, my first school. It wasn't very, very strong, but it was there. And actually, I remember finding an old school book, and it was in my baby writing, and sort of talking about this Jesus story, narrative around Jesus. And then I thought, wow, the conditioning really does start early, doesn't it? So really um, the drive for me here is to sort of address and unpick and unravel that conditioning. So I wanted to go right back to the beginning, and I lighted on the Exodus story. So, I mean, something to say about this is that, of course, there's this deep research, but I'm still very instinctive as well. So it's not a kind of, I'm not dryly um, referring back. I have to respond intuitively to the particular subject or the particular moment within this passage of time, this time or place. Um, and one could suggest there's an element of romanticism around that in the academic sense. So I alighted on the Exodus story, and this became the Exodus series. When I was making the work, the Ukraine invasion happened, and I realized I was making work about the original Exodus, but suddenly there's a new Exodus happening right now. And this is where the yellow and the blue started to come into it. So I started underpainting the paintings in kind of symbolic monochromes, and then painting in the grids, and then taking it from there. And then something else that started to happen um, were the protests in Israel against their own government. So this move during the last, couple of years since Netanyahu has come back into power towards the right, which of course seems to be getting more and more extreme. I'm sure when the show happens will be even more so again. Um, and so I started to work in contemporary, current issues. These images were derived from the protests that were happening in Israel by the Israeli people against the Israeli government. And this is just a year ago. And so from there, we can zoom in, but then zoom back out again. And, I think very rhizomatically, and I see history very rhizomatically. And by that, I mean that I see things in a very three-dimensional way and also a very interconnected way. I
Right.
don't see things as linear as one was taught actually during my history of art degree, history of modern art degree, this linear progression. But I think through, postmodernism, but actually I'd say before that, we've started to unpack the linearity, haven't we? So I prefer a more three-dimensional rhizomatic way of thinking and a non-binary way of thinking. And that really comes into the work now and referencing these, different points in time and place, history, and the current day. Um, so the third sort of part within the third series within that series was Freiheit. And actually, again, I mentioned earlier that the French Revolution interest was triggered by just wanting to know more about Napoleon and going into it. And I developed a strong interest in Germany and the history of Germany. I'm interested anyway. I work with German gallerists and curators and collectors. And one of my German collectors said to me one time, he started to tell me about the history of the French flag, sorry, the German flag, and that actually it's a liberal revolutionary flag. And I found that really interesting. I didn't know it, and I think a lot of German people don't know it actually that I've spoken to. And again, I started to think about, well, if I was to show this to, a generation or two above me, being British particularly, having uncles and grandparents that were in the war, that fought in the war, if I showed the German flag, I think firstly they might have some sort of a reaction, and they'd probably think war, and they'd probably think Hitler. And I just find that really interesting, the fact that, actually the National Socialists got rid of the German flag immediately when they came to power in 33, because it was liberal, because it was revolutionary, and they referred back to the imperial colours of red white and black, which also come into the work. And then this liberal flag was reintroduced in 1945 when the war was over. Um, but in actual fact, I came forward. I did do a lot of research on the history of Germany. Thinking about, again, it's interesting that it's a recent, it's quite a new country really as we know it. It was really only formed as we know it in the late 1800s. And so you have these references to Prussia. You have the red, white, and black in reference to that. The imperial colors of Germany, also the black, the red, and the yellow or the gold in terms of modern Germany. And I really went into the Berlin Wall. So the imagery is derived from original photos of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then, we have JFK being an important protagonist at the time. And then you have this sort of German black letter, German Gothic text coming in. And text, there's an interesting shift in the work going on in terms of, for a long time, I would say it's text-based work, but is actually much more going towards collage-based work. And of course, there's still text within it, but it's less of a dominant component. And there's another piece, though, slightly bigger. This is sort of twice the size, being 60 centimeters tall, or 2 feet 48 inches, something around there. And again, looking at using those images, but different images, using more color as well. Images of the Berlin fall of the wall and Khrushchev as well, who actually won this. And flags are really starting to come into it as well. And again, looking back at my earlier work, it started to suggest to me that there were flag elements just in the compositional design of the work. And of course, I'm looking at flags in a sort of nationalist sense, but also the use of flags in themselves during protests or during celebrations is becoming really relevant as well. So you have this sort of flag reference in at least sort of 3 different layers within the work. And I around that time, this series, the Freedom series, came just a little bit after the works that we've just looked at. And I became really interested in the civil rights. The other interesting thing is that, when I show these paintings to people now, this, as well as the Exodus works, they, as works in themselves, the interpretation of them continues to shift. And I'm really interested in that as well. And, we started off by talking about how I want the interpretation to be open and there are no mistakes. And what's interesting is that, we might have one interpretation of this painting or the Exodus painting 1 year ago or 2 years ago, as we do now or tomorrow or next year. So I really went into the civil rights. I think in some ways it's a sideways step from looking at the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'm really interested in this kind of flashpoint in the 60s in the US. With these paintings, actually, formally speaking, I actually started to shoot them, which is an idea that I've had for some time, but I've never had recourse to do it. And I lined these up and shot them. And when you see them in the reel, there are, you can see to some extent, I think, on an image. So sometimes the pellets have gone through, sometimes the pellets are bouncing off and leaving an indentation. And then sometimes the pellets are becoming lodged in the surface, and they're all being shot from the same place at the same time. But in this time of assassination, with JFK, with Martin Luther King, who we have here in the middle, it became relevant to actually take that to the paintings. And you can also see that, this blue, I'm using spray paint and really opening that up. So I'm constantly looking for new ways to to paint, new ways to develop visual language. We also have Emmett Till here, so this was, that there are really tragic references within this painting. And then um, the text, "I am a man." Interestingly, I heard it being referenced overnight. Again, we've just had the US election, and it was referenced on a news story about the protests of the bin men, we would say in the UK, the garbage guys, garbage collectors.
Ah,
And it, yeah, and it happened, and Martin Luther King a little bit latterly. I mean, actually, it was just before his assassination, and things were going a little bit downhill for him. Um, and I think at the time you had the Black Panthers coming up, and that the idea of passive resistance was being seen as unsuccessful. But he really backed this protest of workers' rights and increased pay. And their slogan, "I am a man," was just, I find that so potent. And again, there are so many different ways we can interpret that now as well. Um, I think actually the interpretation of this might have shifted within the last 24 hours.
I think you're right.
With the potential of Kamala coming in, but the actuality of Trump coming in.
Well, it's interesting too, where you've placed the blue, because on the American flag, the stars on a unified blue background. You've used it sparingly and also on the edge and also in spray paint, which itself, becomes very pixelated and almost diffused over the work. And so, which I think a lot of people feel about a United States, like it is not as united as the name suggests. And where
Yeah,
you've placed the blue really makes a big difference.
yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I guess that takes us into, for me, not so much so, but I think for many, the use of spray paint is subversive still. And so that's not an interpretation of mine. For me, it's a material, and it's that reference to the street and to graffiti in that historical sense. But in actual fact, perhaps we could or should consider it as a subversive material and action in itself. And yeah, that, I mean, that will take us on. Perhaps we'll return to that in a few images' time with a street project that I did this year as well. Um, I was asked to make two pieces before the UK election, and by a really interesting project called Flying Leaps. And this is run partly by the owner of Build Hollywood, and Build Hollywood in the UK at least, and they're definitely in New York. I don't know about elsewhere in the States, but they have these huge billboards. So they're one of the leading companies that own the billboards. Um, and this side project called Flying Leaps commissions contemporary artists to make political work that then gets fly posted throughout the cities. So for me, something I haven't touched on so much yet is the visual language. And the visual language of my work comes from the street. I have this strange obsession with, the surfaces of city walls and the worn, textured surfaces, the ripped parts of posters, the bad signage, the graffiti, the holes. I mean, if we look around, probably not so much in the States, but certainly in Europe, you might find bullet holes from the war in particular areas, in particular cities.
Yes.
So there's a history within that. This sense of history is always within there. So, my tools, my kind of my aesthetic is really from the street. So when I was invited to do this project, it felt perfect to me, and so I made these two works on paper. And again, these are small works on paper, A4 size in the UK, just sort of short of a foot, I would say, tall. It works on paper where, still that text is there. As I said, it's always underlying, if not dominant, but it comes back here. I'm using photographic paper, and I'm first of all, I design these grids. I take a particular word and I design these fragmenting grids of a particular word. And in the UK, the slogan of the Labour Party was change. That was the big message.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
that that was used this year, and so that's the word that I went with. And interestingly, having dipped into it, the word change has been used by every political party in the UK at some point for their election campaign. So that's Labour, um, Conservative, so the left and the right, the Liberal Democrats, even the BNP party, which were a far right party for a while. All of them have used change one way or another within their polemics, I would say. So for this project, that's what I went with here, and then used the red and the blue, referencing both the UK flag, but also the red being the Labour Party and the blue being the Conservative Party. I think for you guys, it's the other way around, isn't it? So
Right.
those are the reference points within the work. I'm printing out the text on the photographic gloss paper, then I work over it with acrylic, and then again with house paint. I gorge back into it. So I'm sort of using this scratching graffiti technique, almost tattooing the pieces. This was one work, and then the partner piece was back to Exodus. But by this time, the war on Gaza, the current war on Gaza, had started. If you imagine the earlier work, Exodus paintings that I was making was pre-October 23, and this is from 24. So again, so much has happened within this space of time. And so I used the same idea around Exodus, but this time in the Palestinian colors. And it's interesting how that can just be flipped as well. Exodus in reference to Judaism, and then now I'm using it in reference to the sort of the plight of Palestine. So these are the two pieces that I made, and then etched into it. This time you have no war, um, and these two pieces were blown up into street posters. So here you have them here in London, and then they were fly posted over a weekend, and appeared in cities throughout the UK. So this is London, Bristol, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Sheffield, and more. So this was just an incredible project for me in terms of political sloganeering, um, the layers of history and chronology, and also that street aesthetic. So to take the work back into the street, it's just a perfect opportunity for me.
And this
Um,
image and this image is a nice not, I don't even know if nice is the right word, but it is a poignant juxtaposition between, what you referred to as graffiti on the right, when we first started talking, that sort of, more of style. I don't know if stylized is the right word, but more, I don't, I'm lacking for a good descriptor, but very, very different than what your interpretation, or, observations of graffiti is. And I think to your earlier point, both Exodus pieces, or all three in this case, or no, just both Exodus pieces and the change piece do speak again of that repetition of historical events, but in different iterations. And so it's particularly the Exodus piece, because it was sort of a overlapping juxtaposition, as well as that, that the historical aspect and the current actual modern day. And like when you were talking about change, I think, that desire for someone to see things, they don't like what's happening now. And so they think that change will give them something different. But lacking the understanding that they have to be a part of the change. Change just can't happen around them. They have to be a part of it. And so I think it's it can be a very polarizing word, and it can be a very unifying word. And so it's interesting that, it's has so many implications, that so many people have chosen it to get people on their bandwagon, so to speak.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And I mean, the other thing about these fragmented words here as well, is that due to their fragmentation, I started to realize that even though I'm embracing the idea of change, through its fragmentation, I believe that it suggests that perhaps there won't be change, or perhaps there
Right.
won't be change in the way that we want there to be changed.
Exactly. Exactly. There really never is. I think that everybody's idea of change, again, it's this idea that the world is supposed to change around you, when in actuality, you're the one that has to change as the individual. And if the individual changes, then that machinery around them can change. But if individuals choose not to change, so where it's being employed to get people to say, well, vote for this party, or because we're the party of change, and the people who want change are all about change, but really it's that idea that I have to be where the change begins. I have to start to think about life in a different way, and
Mm,
how I fit into it.
yeah, and perhaps
Really a personal direction.
we might need to do some consultation for political parties, I think, Janine, because what about if we had change together, leading on from your point, change together. Then
Sure.
then we are taking a bit of agency, and we're acknowledging that we need to be part of that as well. We can't just sit there and wait for it to happen. But then again, that's within the work, isn't it? This sense of protest. But then on the other side of that, protest used to really be able to cause change. The civil rights protests were absolutely potent, and they caused change. We're not there yet, are we, completely? But there was significant change that happened for the good.
Right.
Um,
Right. I'm not sure I think the outrage, I think with the civil rights movement in the United States, particularly the populations that were affected were so also involved. So what you saw there was um, Black people who were working on their own behalf to fight racism. I think what's happening now, whereas, the country is being sort of turned against immigrants, you're not seeing, with the exception of a few small populations of people, you're not seeing that. They're not advocating for themselves, unfortunately, because they're in such a precarious and dangerous position that they're afraid to do so. And so
mm,
without that, it's really hard to get that change together, because it's really hard for them to say, we're going to advocate for ourselves, because it's not like the civil rights movement. It's more of a hidden kind of in I don't know, we could talk for hours on that issue, but
mm.
I see your point, and I see what you're trying to, and I see the point you're trying to make.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then I think so. So not only do we need uh, uh, people to be together, to move together, as you're suggesting, but also leadership as well. Perhaps that's not what's there right
Well,
now.
sure.
So you
I
need
mean,
leadership.
right. I mean, the key to leadership to some degree is followers, right? So people who are going to who hold the same ideals. And I do have to say that, particularly being a poll worker yesterday, I really do feel that's why our election turned out the way it did today. Is I think that sometimes not everybody can be a leader, but sometimes when you don't know how to lead, it's just easier to be a follower and I feel like now the expectation is everything's going to get better because I don't have to be directly involved anymore. And now I have a leader who's just going to change everything around me. And
Mm,
I'm not quite, we have seen that, your work exemplifies the idea that we have seen this in history over and over, and typically it does not end well for those people who are just going to be sort of at the mercy of their leader.
yeah, and therein is the point that you also raised in your introduction about warning against the future as well.
Yes, yes, yeah.
So
I mean, Really, your work does your bio very accurately reflects your work. And I think one of the things I like for people to do is to, I know you were saying about the title. When I'm walking people through an exhibition, I always sort of cover it because I want them to stand in front of it and kind of absorb and, you know, take time. And particularly with your work, the pieces with the collage and the pieces here with the, you have to look beyond the words to see the no war. You need to spend time in front of it. And exactly. So pieces like this, I have to stand in front of to make sure that I get all of it.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and then that, that's back to the point, isn't it, about interpretation and those steps of interpretation. So, I'm interested to know what people make of the work, having not read anything about the practice or having not watched this video or spoken to me about it. So, what is the interpretation? And then then there's a hint in the title, and then step three, then let's talk and unpack it, and that involves me wanting to hear as well. So these are three
Oh,
images of that street project. So they were just battered everywhere. It was a fascinating thing. And then also I flipped them into t-shirts as well. So you can see I'm wearing one of the Exodus t-shirts, but
yes.
perhaps I should have worn change one, but we've got change behind me. So
I think Exodus might be more appropriate this morning.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. Well, the next one. So I kind of started this side project called Destroy Projects. Not to go into too much now, but it's something I'd like to expand actually in it, and it's almost like a kind of diffusion, which is artist t-shirts, artist work on paper, and artist editions. So I've started it just with my own work as pretty much a test really, and to build the thing. Um, and yeah, so that's where these came from. I did actually make a Carmela t-shirt, but um, we're not going to run with that. But the next one will be resist, and I think that is now appropriate. So
I
we're
think
not
so
going to run
too.
with Carmela. We're going to run with resist.
I like resist, and I am a fan of resilience because I feel that um, you know, you did mention a democracy and resist and democracy. I know that they are intertwined. Um, Again, I feel like the country is just kind of pushing toward greater unification. And I'm not sure, from what I'm hearing this morning, I'm hoping that that is possible. I'm not sure it will be. I don't know.
Mm.
I think it's
Yeah,
gonna, we're going to see. Yeah, we're going to see. And but
yeah,
a piece like this image, the sites of conflict, the Guernica piece. Of course, when I saw the title, my mind goes to Picasso, but at the same time, I recognize that this is a piece in front of which you must stand for a long time and really absorb. And I think that every time you visit it, you're going to see more and more uh, images that are both recognizable and not, and how those two things fit together.
mm. Yeah. I mean, this it's an outlier. This piece, it just became really collage. Really heavily collaged, and like I've said a few times, sometimes the work just leads itself. There's not an instruction manual, and the this the origins of this piece. Again, this is from 2024. Um, I was invited into an exhibition by a curator in the UK called Virginia Dampser, and she was curating an exhibition at a gallery in Cork Street, which, for those that don't know, that's sort of one of our um, sort of main gallery streets historically. And what Virginia was doing was pairing historical artists with contemporary artists, and it was an amazing lineup. It had Talar and Keith Tyson and Gavin Turk and Michael Craig Martin, who has a mega retrospective at the Royal Academy now.
Oh,
And then each artist was paired to a historical artist, either because the curator and the gallery had sort of seen a connection, or they were invited to respond. And I was invited into the exhibition, and Virginia said to me, "I'm going to give you Picasso." And I
Oh,
thought, I'll take it. I love the idea of that. And
yeah.
my immediate thought was Guernica.
Yes.
And it had to be, if you imagine, I've become programmed in this way now. And so, even though the Picassos that were in the show, all of these artists were in the exhibition, both the contemporary and the historical.
Oh,
They were very soft later pencil drawings, figurative pencil drawings. But I just couldn't get away from the Guernica idea, and I went back to re-researching Picasso, going through the blue period and the rose period and having a look around, and I had to come back to Guernica, and so that took me into the Spanish Civil War,
yes.
which I think is a subject that is unknown, or should be more known, let's say. It's not really a conflict that people really talk about, but it was so important, and that, from the early 30s, I think it was 30, 36 to 39, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and you had a left wing liberal government, and then you had genuine fascists wanting to take control, and backed by the German fascists and backed by the Italian fascists, and they won. They took power,
Yeah.
and the amazing thing to think about is the fact that they were in power until the 70s. So they were neutral during the Second World War, and so avoided what happened to Germany and Italy, but actually won. They won, and there was a fascist government for 40 years approximately. And so, this was a really interesting subject for me to go into. And, again, I mentioned earlier that there's a sense of romanticism, and there was a sense of romanticism around this conflict ideologically. You had George Orwell going over to fight. You had Ernest Hemingway going over to report. Um, and so, within my research, again, I was reading history books, but I was watching films. I was reading Hemingway. I read For Whom the Bell Tolls, To Whom the
Close.
Bell
Yeah.
Tolls,
Mhm.
um, which is just a fantastic novel, unbelievable. And the subject is the Civil War. And so, this piece really took me there in a way. I inhabit the subject when I'm making work around it. Um, and the imagery here, we've got photographs, or photography. We have we have the anarchists, and this is where I learned that the anarchists use red and black, um, but then also so did the fascists, and this feeds into the next work that I'll show you.
And
And
that
then you have,
harkens back to the French Revolution of red and black too. So it's
yeah,
all
yeah,
kind
and then
of
you have the Russians there, trying to promote communism. So in the top left corner, this is a Russian flag. There's Russian text. In the top right, these are actually very recent um, Spanish protests. So this red, gold, and purple flag, that was the liberal flag at the time. That was the liberal Spanish flag. And there have been significant protests in recent times. I think 2018, both in favour of fascism and then also counter protests against fascism. And then underlying it, you have um, you have this red graffiti which you can just pick out, and
yeah.
underneath it, the graffiti, and it's very sprawled again, and it reads "Kill Lies All." Um, and this is a reference to the actual Guernica painting, and when it was in the US, and I believe it was when it was at the MoMA,
Hmm.
because Picasso didn't want it to be, he wouldn't have it in Spain, and he wouldn't
Right.
return to Spain, I believe,
Right.
whilst there was a fascist government.
Hmm.
Um, and in actual fact, therefore, he never got to return. He never got to see the painting there. But it was vandalized in the either the late 70s or the early 80s when it was at MoMA, and there was this big red graffiti, "Kill the Lies All," sprayed over the original actual Guernica painting.
Oh my, I
So
did not know
that's
that.
a reference here. But not only that, it turns out that it was Tony Shafrazy who went on to be the, very successful gallerist dealing in Basquiat and so on. And he
Yes.
was he was at the time the artist who vandalized Guernica.
No.
Yeah, in the US as well, in New York. So there's a reference that it doesn't get more subtle than that really, and so I have to unpack that one because we can't even see the graffiti, let alone the fact that the story behind it. And so yeah, so this went really collage, and I also sourced some originals. So on this left section, see where there's these kind of more like drawing and striations, and also in the center right, you can start to pick out the nose. And I sourced Picasso preliminary drawings that went into Guernica and then collaged them into the work as well.
I
So
was
you
going to
get
ask you if you had maybe somehow slipped him in there. So, okay.
he's slipped in there, he's embedded, but it's so difficult to find. I think you're so insightful when you say that. The painting, if we didn't have this background, if there wasn't someone there to explain it, I think it needs the title Guernica. Um, but there's a lot to unpack in it. And of course, just to say, Guernica is a small Basque Spanish town. Um, and the atrocity was um, a, effectively a test run of extreme bombing by the Germans, and I think the Italians as well. And they came in and they bombed the whole town, and they bombed it on market day. And it's unknown how many died, whether it's hundreds or thousands, but a lot of women, a lot of babies, a lot of children, certainly many, many innocents. And it was the German and the Italian Air Force that bombed it, and that's really where they were testing these blitzes pre-war. So it was basically a test run, and that was basically a combination, an agreement between the Spanish, Italian, and German fascist powers at the time, and that's what happened at Guernica, and that's why Picasso made that painting, which became such a fundamental symbol of peace. And there's actually a tapestry of it that hangs in the UN, and it was once covered during a pitch, we should say, I think. And that pitch, so if you imagine it's taking place in the UN headquarters, they pulled curtains over the tapestry of Guernica, and it was the pitch to go into Iraq.
Ah, interesting.
And
Yeah,
they didn't want
because
to
I
have
mean,
this
it's
symbol there, this kind of this powerful um
depiction.
powerful piece that really sort of reveals the atrocities of war.
Absolutely. And so, yes, you would think that it does have to have it hanging there you said the UN.
Yeah,
Yeah, and supposedly a place that is, seeking peace, is a poignant reminder of war.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then the following piece after that, so this is where I'm keeping with the grids, and this shows us what's happening and about to happen as well. So this is a good place to sort of end with the images in terms of I've adopted the red and black, which on one hand, originally for me, I'm referencing the anarchists, um, but at the same time, then discovered that the fascists actually used red and black grids within their military insignia.
Hmm.
Um, and so this is a hint to what's to come within the exhibition in terms of new forthcoming work.
And so you're going to build, are you, so So is it accurate then to say that you will continue creating work in this similar style moving forward?
Yeah, definitely. But as I said, I'm always looking for evolution as well. And so there are things that will happen that I don't know are going to happen yet. So
Yeah,
um,
you know,
this is the retrospective. You could say some of this that's considered as retrospective work. A number of the pieces are from this year, so I don't think we can necessarily consider them as retrospective. But within the new work, I'm going to be experimenting with. Here's a teaser as to what might happen. But experimenting with combining the elements of these themes within singular pieces. Um, and also, technically speaking, I'm becoming interested again in becoming more painterly as well. So I think we might see more painterly work, perhaps more fragmented work. And whether or not I get to this topic for this show, um, a subject that I've wanted to tackle for a long time but haven't is Ireland as well, the history of Ireland.
okay, well, there's certainly, in the concepts that you've covered previously, you're not going to lack for subject matter if you choose to go there. But one thing you said as we were chatting about change, when you talked about change together, I'm a big law of attraction girl, so I feel like, the more peaceful work that's out there. But I recognize it, and I recognize that you are actually depicting history. So these are things that have actually happened. And, I feel like there's more war than peace.
Could you repeat that?
More war than peace.
There is more war than peace. That's right.
And it's more ubiquitous. It's everywhere, as opposed to, I don't know if it's just that peace isn't as attractive or joy isn't as attractive. Obviously, that it didn't that unification, that bipartisanship didn't seem to appeal
Mm.
in our particular election. And it's interesting to wonder, because you're certainly not the first artist that's drawn to these themes of revolt and revolution and war and turmoil um and similar things, um as a reflection of the population. And so it becomes a deep sort of, we're not going to psychoanalyze it, but it really becomes a deep sort of reflection of perspective. I mean, one of the things that the Torrance Art Museum does an excellent job of is, that almost every single exhibition that Max has in both the main gallery and in gallery 2, and often in the dark room, uh, is this deep-seated artistic, artists who are expressing their dissatisfaction with the world and their expression of it in their work. And so that speaks volumes, actually. It really does.
I think we have to be driven to make work. I don't think, well, certainly let's just say personally speaking, I can't just make work for the sake of it.
Sure.
And as I said, I would consider this a mature phase. So really, when I've got into the nub of the issues that I want to be dealing with, and it just so happens that revolution has led to resistance, has led to conflict,
Yeah.
and yeah, I think if one wants to open up a dialogue and a conversation, and perhaps, dare I say it, to affect some sort of change, certainly understanding, then we have to look at subjects that are troublesome and that we're dissatisfied with. I don't have an interest in painting peace. That's
Yeah.
and an additional point, when you said we're not going to psychoanalyze, which we need another expert for that. But I think that is actually a really interesting point to bring up, and that is, you know, how much further would one go if one was psychoanalyzed in order to understand, you know, the drives and motivations within oneself. I think that would
Yes.
be at some point. I think that probably will have to be done as part of the practice.
Right. Right. I mean, when, what the work that we see, the work that again, and my role here is simply to showcase and have the artists who are showing at the Torrance Art Museum expound on their work, which you've done extraordinarily eloquently today. But that idea that perhaps what you are revealing as artists who see the world in a very, very different way is this sort of underlying feeling of discord that sort of threads itself through the tapestry of humankind.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, without doubt. And it's inevitable that it will continue to happen. And there is always war, there is always conflict. I mean, all of us at any given age, really, have, even though it might not be on our doorstep, have lived through it. But it does feel like it's getting closer as well, again, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I think this is an important time to be tackling these subjects when for us, we had Brexit that that has its own implications in terms of unity or the fragmentation of
Yes.
unity that was
Yes.
in
Right.
place. As
Right.
already discussed, we have Ukraine. Um, you know, we have quite conflicting election processes in the US. What will be the response now to Putin from the Trump government? That's another question. We have Israel and Gaza, which is becoming more and more disastrous by the week or day or month, whichever way you want to look at it. It just seems to be moving so quickly. So I think globally, we haven't even touched on China and what any implications might be there. So Taiwan, etc. So I think that we're in a point globally where, if we're astrological about it, then there seems to be there seems to be something governing this right now, and we're in that, aren't we? So I think as an artist, as a someone with some kind of antennae, as artists have, then it's important to respond to that.
Absolutely.